There's always been an age-old question. What is the most dominant fighting style in the world? Hello, my name is Osar Tanamofwan, and today I'll be telling you about how an organization called the UFC, in search of this answer, and despite struggles, became one of the most successful brands in the world. The UFC is an organization that promotes mixed martial arts. Their fighters are known globally, and the brand itself is worth billions. Although they're experiencing success today, it should be acknowledged that the road to success is not an easy one, and a lot of struggles had to be overcome. First, I'll tell you about their early years, which includes their first shows and its influences. Next, I'll tell you about the Dark Ages, which was the most problematic era for the UFC. And lastly, I'll tell you about the purchase, which includes the ownership and led to the success today. In the early 1990s, a marketing executive named Art Davie, and with curiosity of fighting and a burning desire to learn what is the best martial arts out there, discovered the Gracies, a family of Brazilians. Rorion Gracie and his family had initially learned Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a grappling martial arts, from a Japanese instructor named Matsuo Maeda, and they had already been established in the U.S. when they came across Art Davie. After crossing paths, these two were now in discussion of starting a fighting company. Despite being turned down all over America, they still continue to go cross country looking for any broadcaster that would take up their deal. Finally, a pay-per-view company called Semaphore Entertainment Group jumped on their idea. After a venue was chosen and the fighter selection process had began, it seemed like the UFC was getting closer and closer to making their debut. With the intention of proving just how effective Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was, Rorion Gracie actually chose one of his weakest, least attributable brothers to represent their family during this contest. On November 12, 1993, the UFC made its debut. After a long night of fights and a lot of successful fighters, Royce Gracie would still prove to be winner, thus proving that the sport of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was very effective. Apart from the Gracies proving their point, the event as a whole was actually a success. And obviously more shows were to come. Due to the growing number of viewers that the UFC were having now and the potential that the owners knew it had, now they were thinking of what is the best way to advertise the sport. Their following actions now would then lead to what is known as the UFC's Dark Ages. 2 men enter, 1 man leaves, no rules. These were just some of the different ways the UFC thought to advertise their product. Sometimes they even claimed death as a possibility. But with the bigger crowds came the bigger controversy. Dubbed as human cockfighting by some, politicians such as John McCain were in the front lines of a media campaign to end the UFC. Producers found themselves in court constantly defending their product. More and more politicians began jumping on board, putting pressure on their colleagues, so much so that the entire state of New York would go on to ban the sport as a whole. Until this day, MMA is still banned in the state of New York. Despite their initial success in the first few events they had, obviously new obstacles still had to be overcome, and these obstacles just kept piling up. Pay-per-view providers even stopped broadcasting some of their shows, and after so many losses that the UFC experienced, they now figured that it was time for some changes. To clean up the sport and have a more professional look, new rules became implemented. Things such as fence grabbing, fish hooking, and headbutts, these were all taken out, and instead they were replaced with time constraints and proper gloves for the fighters. Even though all these efforts were made, the sport itself was already labeled, and unfortunately they had already gained a bad reputation. Due to all these significant losses, investors such as the SEG Broadcasting Group backed out, and with no other options, the UFC was now up for sale. The dark ages were now over, and the next phase of the UFC's life was about to begin. Due to all these struggles faced, people always thought like what the UFC really needed was a really rich fan that enjoyed the sport. And thus came the Fertitta brothers. After these two wealthy casino owners crossed paths with a boxing promoter named Dana White, they initially started learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu just with the interest of the sport at heart and nothing more. And then, upon hearing that the UFC was up for sale, Dana White convinces the Fertitta brothers to buy the product. And when they announced like they were buying the product, the previous owners were happy to sell. And within no time, the UFC was now under new management, and their new brand owners were now called the Zuffa, which was Italian for a fight. And on February 23rd, 2001, the first Zuffa show aired live. Still struggling to fix its bad reputation, the Dana White and the Fertitta brothers pitched a reality show called The Ultimate Fighter. This show was intended to show the masses how like humanized the sport could be and how real like everyday people the fighters actually were. Not only meant to humanize the sport, the finale itself, featuring fighters Stephan Bonnar and Forrest Griffin, what proved to be the most significant event in the UFC's history. The fight was so entertaining between these two that ratings actually grew as the fight aired. So people were calling their friends, calling their neighbors, like, hey, turn to the channel, watch this fight. It was an epic fight. This fight is actually noted to bring in UFC into the mainstream. Following this, the stars began to align for the promotion. Popular fighters started to emerge. Fighters such as BJ Penn, Chuck Liddell, George St. Pierre, they all started making names for themselves. And then UFC began purchasing other mixed martial arts organizations such as WFA, WEC, and Pride were all purchased. And then in 2009, they finally celebrated their 100th anniversary event, and it included a fighter and wrestler named Brock Lesnar, a very popular person. After so many years, the brand was no longer struggling, but instead they were a hot commodity. The UFC had survived all these struggles, and because of this, MMA is thriving today. All in all, it should be noted that anyone going through some struggles and tough times can acknowledge the fact that despite these hardships and controversies, UFC and their executives managed to persevere to become what they are today. With newer techniques being learned every day, bigger sponsors, multiple countries showing and broadcasting the sport, it's no wonder why mixed martial arts is considered the fastest growing sport in the world. And I'd like to end with a famous quote by President Dana White of the UFC. I don't care what color you are, I don't care what country you're from, I don't care what language you speak. We're all human beings. Fighting is in our DNA, we get it and we like it. Thank you.